You're live.
Is Senate Transportation. We are Thursday, April 17th. We are talking about page 488, and we have it's the discussions about section 28 and 29, complete street. And we've had a lot of questions about what's going on, where we are, and that, and you're the key person for us to talk to.
Absolutely.
So name and
Thank you, Chair Westman. I'm Erin Sisson, for the record. I'm the Deputy Chief Engineer at the Agency of Transportation. And my colleague Matthew Arroncio is here as well. We're going to do a little two-part update for you all about where we're at with the Vermont Multimodal Roadway Guide, which is the replacement for the Vermont State Design Standards, and then the Complete Streets training that we're looking at rolling out with municipalities in the next year. So feel free to interrupt and ask questions along the way. And we do have a quick presentation. So just as a recap, the Vermont State Design Standards for you all were last published in the 90s. And this was under rulemaking and statute at that time in 19 VSA Part 10C. So it references state design standards that go beyond the national standards so that our roadways in Vermont and our transportation system can be particular and context sensitive to our needs in the state. So at that time in the 90s, that was already a thought, but this update is really going above and beyond that and taking it to the next level. So really, this was just trying to make sure that at the time, our designers, our engineers had consistent guidance and framework to go on in order to create consistency across our network. I know yesterday there was a question about updates to the statute that reference the state design standards. So that is a thing that through rulemaking, we may have to look at that language and just make sure that we're not, by changing the name and sort of shifting how we're framing this, we'll just need to make sure that we're not in conflict. And if we are, we'll just need to make sure we update a couple of things there. But it seems like it should be relatively straightforward in that front. And so while we're doing the update, a lot of the nation is moving away from quite as rigid of standards and moving more towards a guidance framework where there's engineering judgment and flexibility, things that have always been taught in the engineering profession, but really expanding it to making sure that it's additionally context sensitive, there's additional flexibility, and so that there's not sort of a one-size-fits-all approach to any particular piece of transportation when every situation can be a little bit different. There's been language in the PACT UT bill that I believe in 2022 was the first time that the Senate and House Transportation Committees were interested in seeing updates along the way on this. And so the last couple of years, we've been coming in and providing updates. The past language was really focused on our public outreach process and our stakeholder engagement. So there's a lot of detail in last year's transportation bill related to that. But really, we're building on previous efforts, moving in the directions as directed by legislative language, but we're all really excited about this transition. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what we did over the last year. So in late 2023, we had sort of solidified all of our public engagement process, everything we needed to do to really kick off the project. And then we were able to hire a consultant team. So we developed the RFP, the request for proposals, and we selected VHB and Tool Design, who are both local and national engineering firms who really were able to help us develop what this should look like, what the process would look like, and be the experts on a nationwide level who have done this before and can really help Vermont go through a similar effort. Because of the importance of the public engagement and the stakeholder engagement, we developed 3 sort of levels of engagements through a steering committee, a stakeholder advisory group, and a technical working group. So that stakeholder advisory group is the one that really encompasses Local Motion as one stakeholder who's in the room, I know, VAPTA, the ACCD, the Community and Commerce and Development, ANR, Agency of Natural Resources, Transportation for Vermonters, the Vermont Truck and Bus Association. There's a whole slew of folks that have competing interests potentially that are in the room at each step so that we can make sure that we're meeting the needs of everybody as best as we can. So the first step that our consultant team did was making sure that we reviewed all of the Vermont documents. So I was just explaining that in Vermont, in any state, there's a lot of different standards and policies and guidance to be following for engineers, planners, and anybody in their professions. And so making sure that we understood all of the different standard drawings, engineering instructions, national guidance from whether it's AASHTO or NCHRP or others that we make sure that we are looking at everything and understanding how this document can be an umbrella to pull all of those together and give an engineer or a planner sort of a one-stop shop to say, if I pick up this document, this is going to help point me to every different resource depending on what it is that I want to do, what I need to design. It feels a little bit aspirational, but it definitely, it's needed, and it's going to be a really important transition. Then we made sure that we looked at national precedent guidance. So other states have moved in this direction. There's a few examples from Colorado, Florida, Massachusetts that are really good examples. And we've been making sure that we're looking at either lessons learned or successes that those states have had to make sure that we're learning from them and updating ours appropriately. And then related to public information meetings, at the end of last year, we had 4 different public information meetings to make sure that we were inviting beyond that stakeholder group, anybody who's interested in learning more about this. We had different locations around the state with 2 in-person hybrid meetings and 2 virtual meetings. A couple were during a lunch hour, a couple were in the evening, just to try to make sure we were capturing anybody who might be interested in learning about this. So that was a great way for folks to get an update, give their input where they wanted to, and learn more. And then similarly, this is the project website. So anybody can go there, see the public meeting agendas and notes, for example. So you could go in and see what conversations were had at different public meetings and really understand how we got to the point that we're at. Part of what we're doing with this guidance, and on the left-hand side here, you'll see different states and different guidance that is moving in this direction, is that we're thinking about it as a paradigm shift more towards context sensitivity, where you're not thinking about the classification of the roadway. I'm sure you've all heard of minor arterial, major collector. That's a federal highway classification system that has been really helpful in the past, but I'll show you an example of how we're going to be shifting that language a little bit and working towards this sort of framework where you're thinking about, are you in a rural area? Are you in an urban area? Is it suburban? And how do we transition between those different land use contexts to make sure that the transportation needs are being met? And so this is the example of the roadway classification language, where in this example in Randolph, this is I-89 exit 4 and Randolph Center and the Vermont State University on the right-hand side. This road is a major collector all the way through, and you can see the different colors because we highlighted the different look and feel and the transportation needs that this road has, depending where it is on this part of 63, I believe it is.
66.
66, thank you. And so in the left, in the downtown area, there's obviously a need for pedestrian movements. There's sidewalks, crosswalks. And then in the middle by the interstate, it's more a lot of big trucks, it's turning movements, it's vehicular focused, but this is all the same classification of roadway. And per some of our old practices, we may be tempted to treat this roadway similarly throughout, even though there's very different functional needs. And so if we shift to an outcomes-based solution, we're thinking of, even though this roadway is the same classification the whole way, is it in a rural setting? Is it a connector where you're transitioning from one area to another? Or is it a downtown, sort of village, a rural town? And the needs are very different. And so your outcomes that you want to drive at as an engineer or a planner are very different. And so that's how we're trying to think about it. And in a fortunate, there was a lot of conversation last year, I'm sure you remember, related to Act 181, which is the land use bill, and related to land use mapping. All of the RPCs are working on developing maps for their regions that outline their land use. And so what we're excited about doing is overlaying our transportation uses with those land use maps and making sure that they're reflective of each other, supportive of each other, and so that it's not just the functional classification, but also the land use context as defined by the communities and the RPCs to make sure that we're getting the best outcome for that area. And so sort of where we're at in the current status is we just went through that whole year, like I outlined, about focusing on project and public meetings, project engagement, making sure that we're meeting the needs of a lot of different stakeholders. And actually 2 weeks ago, the consultants delivered an outline, and I should say we called it an outline, but it's detailed. It's 85 pages already. So they've got a really robust set of how is this new documentation going to look compared to the old document, and internally to AOT. We're reviewing that right now and just making sure it's aligning with everything that we heard from our stakeholders, and all of the needs that we have. And so really over the next year, we're going to be digging into more detail, developing that framework and building out that full draft, which is going to be ready by early next year. And we can keep you all in the loop on that. And then after that, there's really this level of implementation and training so that we're not just building this beautiful document, this shifting this paradigm and putting it on a shelf, but we need to make sure our planners, our engineers, our municipal partners, our regional planning partners all understand how that this guidance and this sort of toolkit can best be used. So there will be that component as well.
Go ahead.
So is the outline something that we would be able to look at?
So we are reviewing it.
Not officially look at, just look at.
So I would offer that we have it internally, but I want to make sure that the agency has taken a close look at it. And then after that, when the consultant updates it and make sure that it's in alignment with our vision, then we're going to be sending it out externally. So I can absolutely include you all on that distribution.
Okay, cool.
Probably in about a month or so.
That's great. And then it's wonderful that you're coordinating with 181.
Yeah.
That makes just so much sense. And I'm interested to know if you're going to have things that will be required, that will be more than a guideline, especially when towns start doing reviews that they have not yet done, that V-Trans has done in Active 50. That transition, I'm just concerned about that transition.
Yeah. So part of how we envision this is that this is a shift towards guidance and engineering flexibility and context flexibility, where when we start making requirements, it can quickly get into, well, that's great in that situation, but how do we handle it in this situation? So a really intentional piece of this transition is to back away from requirements. However, there's a lot of other engineering instructions and standards and policies within the agency and within the nation where that can be the place where we dictate if there's a minimum, and that can be the place that we dictate what that might look like dependent on the situation. So this won't get into shalls and requirements. This will be, here is where you look if you need to look for a requirement for a sidewalk width, which we all know is relatively standardized, right? So this will not get into that level of requirement.
But something somewhere will,
Yeah.
like bus shelters and bus stops.
Right.
Andy.
But will you have shall consider or shall look at those kind of shalls instead of saying it shall be X centimeters wide, but you would say shall consider pedestrians when you're in the town center. You shall consider bikes when you're in this kind of situation. That kind of shit.
We could, part of my, and maybe I'm with the engineering background, a little bit black and white. To me, that takes away a little from the engineering flexibility still when you're saying shall, but then consider. It feels like, why not just say, here's your toolbox of everything that you should be considering, and then let them, in alignment with whatever the outcomes that are needed in the area, determine what makes the most sense. So I don't know in terms of the exact language yet, but.
Well, I guess, and maybe we'll hear from those stakeholders that are participating if they feel like the process is hearing that. But I think in the past, people have said, like, we want to make sure it's pedestrian bike friendly or safe. And then the project comes out and they didn't do that. And they're like, well, we were focused on cars because that's what our mission was. So that's the whole idea about complete streets, kind of forcing people at least to consider it.
Sure.
Not say like, well, that wasn't part of our charge.
Sure. And I definitely want to shift that mentality of whenever a project comes through, I would hope that nobody is saying our mission was vehicles, because our mission is transportation, and that looks very different depending on who you are, how you're using the system. So complete streets, as an example, will be a part of what this document points to, where, again, I think the legal language says it shall be considered, right? And so that's where the nuances of this document and how it incorporates complete streets and how the complete streets language is written,
Right.
has some layers to it that I get can feel a little convoluted, but how this exact language will look, we'll have to keep refining that too.
And I think that was the concern that our White's bill was to kind of try to force it more, but I don't know if that's needed based on how things are going currently, and we'll hear from others.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah, can I just follow up on that?
Sure.
Because I'm sure somewhere it says, look at all of the users.
Mhm.
And so the design is really important, obviously, but then the process is really important too, because we need to have say, the answer I hear, or the reason I hear is, oh, we couldn't afford it, right? But there might be,
Right.
yeah, but there might be other sources of funding, or someone nearby might want to chip in, business. So the process also needs to give some time to find other ways to provide the thing if the initial determination is we don't have enough money for the bike lane or whatever it is.
Mhm. Yeah, agreed. And that's where we've talked a lot about that, because this will be planning and engineering guidance. And then we need to make sure that our process documentation as to how we go about engaging the public, as to how we look at our funding sources early on, will be able to complement that. So yeah, absolutely. The process is critical. And I think we've been doing a lot better with that, but I'll always review that.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And that is all I was going to update you related to the multimodal guidance. And I know there was some interest in the Complete Streets specific component related to the training. So happy to either take any other questions or pass it to my colleague.
I think we'll stick around and we'll pass it to your phone.
I just one quick question on the timeline. If we were to, I don't know if you looked at the language that was in the, I can't remember the bill number, but if that language was included, then what would that mean for the process? Is it, one of my concerns, I support the language in general, but the process is already too far along to be like inserting some language like that.
As it relates to this guidance document or as it relates to projects?
That document. But the language is the document, when you redo the standards, they shall do these things.
Right.
So you're like, well, we're already in step 2.
Right.
We'd have to go back to step 1 or not. Like, I don't know if you have a comment.
I'm not sure that I've seen the latest language from the bill that you're referencing, but I would say, we can work with you all if there's language that you're looking to include and see how it might be applicable. But I think in terms of the intent and the basic framework of this document, we're moving in a really good direction, and we can fine tune anything that you all feel like could be valuable, but maybe we can look at that closer.
Go ahead, Michelle.
Michelle Boomhauer, Agency of Transportation. Matthew may be able to speak to this as well when he comes up, but I think having the shall language and the prescriptive elements that are within the proposal would be in conflict with what Aaron just explained in terms of what we are trying to do with this umbrella guidance and process, and then how the other documents that have the shalls, like the Complete Streets guidance, nest under that. And through the training process, people will understand, like, here's the framework of flexibility, but you must do these things depending on whatever the other overlays are that are appropriate to the situation. So I think that was like one of the fundamental concerns about the language.
Great. Well, I'll let you hear a little bit more about Complete Streets from Matthew.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Matthew Arancio, I'm a regional planning manager in our policy planning and research division of the agency. Very happy to be here today. Thank you for the time. So just to dive right into it, you'll see that this first page very much mirrors Division Director Boomhauer's testimony from yesterday in terms of where we're at in the brass tacks of the Complete Streets program as it relates to the creation of a document, internal training and external training. But I just want to come back to those points to kind of structure my overall testimony here. So we have a website. I highly encourage you to go take a look at it, as well as our 2023 Complete Streets guidance document. I reviewed it this morning, and it helps to kind of enrich some of the testimony that I'll bring here today. our first stop after creating that guidance document in 2023 was to envision an internal training, which we deployed this winter and spring. As you all know, that training consists of 3 activities together, which are first a guided walk audit, second, a presentation of the 2023 document and how to navigate it, and then finally, a guided design exercise too. So bringing folks around the table just to mark up a map and have a decision-making process. Where we're going from here, based off of the success of that training, is using that as a model for our external training, the deployment for which is prepared for this fall of 2025. We will be working with our Vermont Local Roads folks, with RPCs as well, and VLCT to deploy this training and provide outreach to municipalities related to this. And we're also looking to do, apart from having some sort of online module, some in-person module as well. So 5 to 6 locations across the state that will be identified with RPCs to, again, enrich the training experience and provide multiple opportunities for folks to engage. So that's a bit of the context for what we're working in terms of timeline as well as content right now. And just to kind of bring together some of the previous testimony by our Deputy Chief Engineer here and think more about the concerns that you all have. The intent of this training is really to aid in the decision-making process of design professionals within the agency. The idea being that we want to present context-based approach to design, but help people understand what that means from a decision-making process when you're sitting in the seat of either an engineer or a planner or an architect or what have you. And so a lot of what you'll see in the 2023 guidance document is related to just that, is really opening up a conversation around decision-making. And we try to approach that from various angles, which is why you see 3 modules associated with this training specifically. Some kind of hot takes from the document itself that we hammer through as part of that guided decision-making process is first and foremost that there is no one complete street. There are many complete street elements that are contextually appropriate that together inform safety and the design of a roadway. And so we like to hammer that home, most importantly with our design professionals, because again, what we talk about here is an a la carte menu of options that are put together based off of, again, observing a context and responding to that context. So that comes with a decision-making process associated with that. So again, you hear context. We've said that multiple times, but that is the name of the game right now, is the idea of what is around us and how can we design for it accordingly. Acknowledging that there are multiple different types of roadway users that might have different priorities in a context. With Aaron's example previously about our downtown Randolph context, what we say from a complete streets perspective would be, you can expect to find pedestrians there and cyclists there and perhaps less automobiles. And perhaps what would be needed there is lower speeds, given that that is a denser setting. And so that's the nature of the type of training that we're giving right now. And then to kind of put the icing on the cake, or the cherry on the sundae, or the icing on the cake, if you will, excuse me, and mix up metaphors and analogies at times, especially when I'm
Is good.
yeah, when I'm caffeinated and happy to talk about the things that I'm talking about. But another important part of this decision-making process is opening up the door for our designers to realize that if you can't install or incorporate complete streets elements, at the very least, think about not precluding them, right? And so it's an important part of what we're trying to shine a light on for folks right now. The example that we have here is the replacement of a culvert. Perhaps there's an opportunity to add a slightly wider extent to that culvert, so that in the future, that if we need wider shoulders to eventually bring in a bike lane, there's an opportunity to do so. And so the idea being that perhaps there aren't opportunities to combine these elements in contextual-based approach that makes sense. But at the very least, if we could not preclude them, that's still from a very real standpoint, a complete streets success, because we at least, excuse the metaphor, but pave the way for future projects to occur. And so if we can set up somebody for future success, that already is a win from what we would like to encourage folks to think. So I get the opportunity now to talk about some more fun things just related to our training. Brought a few pictures here just to kind of give a little bit more meat to what you see behind those bullet points. And I would be remiss in not acknowledging 2 folks that worked very hard on this training along with myself. So Bonnie Donahue is our landscape architect at the agency, and Summer Bukasi is one of our active transportation leads, who you see in the second photo right here at the center of everybody, explaining the complete streets module that we have here. And so the first element of this is a walk audit. The walk audit actually is in downtown Barrie, which we found very interesting because downtown Barrie actually has a lot of Vermont's landscapes nested within it. We have a big town center along a main street, with higher density. We have smaller residential neighborhoods. that are really great, that show that kind of like lower density that we're talking about around the town green here. And we even have larger stretches of roadway that connect those two that mimic to a certain degree state highway in a more rural context, if you will. And so our walking loop is about 1.5 miles. And we walk through each of these contexts with our with our design professionals and just make note of what's happening in the space. As an example, there's a square in downtown Barrie where there are multiple pedestrian crossings. However, those pedestrian crossings don't necessarily align with the local land use or the context. And so what we see are people jaywalking along wide roadways.
Yeah.
And so we ask the question, why is this happening? And we encourage people to think about that. And if there's a design solution for that in the future that could meet that need, how would it look? And so not bribing anybody to be out there on specific days, but I think not each time that I've done this training, there's always been a jaywalker at that location and underscored that need.
Yeah.
And so that's been really interesting to just have folks acknowledge and then unpack what that means from a land use perspective. There's a school or a building here. Somebody wants to get across the street to the post office, and it's not easy to do so. Is there a design solution that could be better in the future? And how can we incrementally get there? And so this walk audit has been a very great tool in that regard to open up this conversation, get people outside of a classroom setting and kind of pivot away from a traditional PowerPoint presentation, just presenting a guidance document.
And this is both agency staff and RPC and town municipal staff.
Yeah, and so this first internal module of the training is specific to agency staff that was identified with Aaron's support, with Michelle's support, and just basically put out to the leaders across the agency whom would be appropriate for this. So we've touched all divisions as part of this training, which has been really a great success associated with it. As well as the folks that you see here are actually our RPCs. And so I oversee the Transportation Planning Initiative. As part of our program, we have a monthly meeting. And so this was our monthly meeting in October where we had them run through the Complete Streets module with us to already kind of get the word out there and preempt them for what they will be involved in terms of the external outreach associated with this in the fall. So that's the kind of first step in our module here. The second is, the photos are out of order. That's a PowerPoint formatting problem. But, the second is actually presenting the guidance document itself, how to navigate that document, what the resources are within that document. And finally, those points that I made previously, just about context-based design, do not preclude. There are many complete streets elements and no one complete street. So, we try to, at least if there are any points that we want to hammer home, it's those 3 specific points. This PowerPoint presentation, again, mainly serves as a way to present the document itself. And then afterwards, just help people answer or ask preliminary questions about complete streets thought as it's presented therein. Finally, we do a design module. So that's where I get when I was alluding to guided decision-making process. We actually throw a map on the table into small groups. We'll divide the group into small groups, throw a map on the table of a few different types of contexts. One of them is Williamstown, if I'm not mistaken. One of them is a smaller, more rural context with an even smaller town center, and have folks just take a look at it and do the same assessment that we talked about during the walk audit. Who is connected to where? What are some of the roadway constraints associated with this context? And most importantly, what are some of the low-hanging fruit opportunities from a complete streets perspective that would be feasible within that context? It's been an interesting journey in that because it's easy to ground oneself in reality and say how things are not possible. But the intent in that is to really just examine space and say, well, it looks like there might be some excess roadway space here that might facilitate a future pedestrian crossing. What might that look like? And just have guide people to at least seeing those opportunities as a first stop to then think about their professional design process as they move forward. And so the activity concludes from there. What I'll say, just kind of summarizing all of this and taking it home for my portion of this, is that we've received really good feedback from our design professionals across the agency about this. Folks have been happy to be engaged in multiple ways to arrive at learning more about that decision-making process. And folks have been happy to kind of get out and about and see what that means in the field in terms of potential connections, missing connections, and what that might look like. And so I think the hot takes here are certainly the purpose of this training is really about guided decision-making and calling people's attention to specific opportunities that then, as informed design professionals, with the support of our existing guidance and new guidance document, can certainly enrich further those 3 talking points around do not preclude, context-based design, and then many complete streets elements. And so that's really what we try to package as part of this entire training here. So happy to take additional questions about this, complete streets, the document itself. If you're looking for an example, like, just to go back to a point related to the tabletop exercise and the appendices of a complete streets document, we actually have an example of what that looks like too, just a before and after streetscape and marked up with some moderate, let's say, geometric changes. So perhaps installing curb extensions and access road space. And so you'll see elements of this training within the document itself, and really happy to talk about it here today.
Thank you. Go ahead.
So this is great. This is all really good stuff. And I live in Brattleboro, and a lot of the existing structures really wouldn't have been able to be built in the 90s.
Mhm.
So some of that charm and just walkability can come back, you know, to other places using, you know, these new guidelines, I'm sure. So just want to mention how towns operate in my experience versus AOT sometimes. And sometimes it takes towns more than 6 weeks to make a decision. And so and I'm not being sarcastic, I don't mean to be sarcastic, but especially towns where the select board does everything and they just meet once a month. And so sometimes just to either get their opinion on things or get them to respond to a grant opportunity, they just can't do it in 6 weeks unless they missed it the year before and somebody remembers to do it the next year. So just process is just so important, and giving towns and RPCs, because recently we're as part of a program that was asking for comments, and it took I don't want to embarrass anybody, but it took an agency in my area probably 2 months to get a statement together, and that wasn't because they were remiss. It's just they wanted to be exactly right, that what they were going to send to the state was reflective. So they had multiple meetings with different folks, and they wanted to make sure that the agency board was on board too. So they had community meetings and they had agency meetings, and it literally took 2 months to get something really valuable to V-Trans. So I just want to urge us to just take time and put in time for towns and RPCs to be able to just, you know, understand it, talk to folks, because towns can be just very, you know, they know their place, you know, their area, and they want things to be right, and this kind of stuff is almost permanent, right? And I love that you're saying don't preclude things. That's so important, and look out for flexibility. That's terrific. So I think all of what you're doing is just great. I just want to encourage a slower process and giving towns and other local agencies time. And then I just have one other comment. I don't know if anybody. Okay, so there's an example in my area, but I'm sure it happens other places too, where one community is impacted by something that isn't another community. Like we have a bridge that is in a town, but only very short in that town. The road is serving another town. So getting those towns to work together, or giving the town that is served by the bridge an opportunity to be part of the conversation when that's not exactly what how the system works, just having that kind of flexibility
Mhm.
is good because you can end up with a better product. Because the town who's more impacted by it could, uh, support it in some way.
Yes. If I
But-
may comment on your first, I think just going back to the speed at which towns work, that's why that do not preclude clause is really important. Because thinking about the sequencing of projects is as valuable as installing something straight away, right? And so if a town, given its resources, can at least set aside space and then come back in a few years after further discussion and think about marking that space differently, or approach the agency accordingly about their vision, if they have the time to develop a vision through the support of the Regional Planning Commission or one of our grant programs as well. That's an opportunity for them to do not preclude, set aside space, define a vision further, come back, talk to us and engage in that discourse involving the RTC and others as well. And so I think that's that kind of timeline and that phasing element is something that we really, and I was remiss in not shining a light on that as part of this document or this reflection, but that's certainly there too. The kind of things might be able to be phased in, and that's also a win.
That's
And
great.
especially given municipalities with limited resources, that in and of itself is an opportunity if we can continue the conversation through the connections that we already have.
Wonderful. And incremental development too.
Incremental, exactly.
I,
That's
I
perfect.
particularly like the wider culvert. If you do the wider culvert, you leave options open for the future.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes we go in and we go, what's the cheapest thing to do? And then we preclude stuff in the future that we look back and go, well, I wish I'd done that just a little different.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So I think, are you? Jonathan. You're Jonathan. I thought you were. If you could move Jonathan into the chair.
The hot seat.
The hot seat. Oh, we aren't that bad. We aren't that bad.
Hands on the back.
Well, you're in your corner. You can turn around and look at the corner.
Sad. Thank you.
We aren't that mean.
No, Thanks, Aaron.
So thank you for having me. I'm Jonathan Weber. I'm the Program Director at Local Motion. We're a statewide advocacy organization. Our mission is to make biking, walking, and rolling safe, fun, and accessible for everyone in Vermont. So I initially prepared the testimony that Megan is kindly handing out to you, which is really focused on Section 30 of S75, the CURT bill, which is all about regulations affecting bicycle operation at intersections. And I am more than happy to give that testimony. I'm also aware that you might be more interested in the T-bill and what we've been talking about with previous speakers with regard to the state standards of big streets. So
If you could, we're happy to hear a little bit. We are on a time crunch because we have to get the T-bill out tomorrow, and the issue in front of us is the more focused language around what's happening now. We don't want to do something in the T-bill that disrupts. We want to be additive to what's going on.
yeah, happy to talk about that. So you can disregard what was just handed out to you, at least for the time being. And I'm going to be speaking just off notes and maybe pull up a couple of related series.
And quite frankly, we're happy to have you back when we're not under a time crunch to get something done.
Happy to come back when you're not on time crunch too. Yeah, so we're a stakeholder advisory group member for the M2D2 Vermont State Standards update. Before getting into the details of how, what's in the current T-bill draft, I want to talk generally about how we see that process going. We're a strong supporter of the project and updating the standards in general. At this stage, there have been a handful of stakeholder group meetings as well as some public meetings. And the process has really just been focused on, as Aaron was talking about, building out that table of contents and sort of the high level outline for the document. So it's been very high level still. And our feeling is that it's going well. We broadly like the direction of more flexibility and providing guidance. We also really want to make sure that is balanced with ensuring a high facility quality for people walking and biking in the areas where those facilities are needed most. and going to be of the highest value. So mostly talking about our more built up areas along routes to school. So I think our primary concern right now, and this is not something that's emerged to the level of a flashing alarm light yet, but our concern is we want to make sure that we're balancing that flexibility with solid guidance that pushes designers and engineers to build high quality active transportation facilities in those areas. We've suggested a variety of methods to achieve that, to make sure that the facilities are of high quality in those areas while providing flexibility still within that mission of providing for high quality facilities. So I'm happy to talk about what that could look like if you all are interested in that. Or I'm happy to get into the details of the bill.
Well, how is that received? I guess I'm more interested in you feeling of the process. I know it's just kind of at the front end, but are you feeling like that's being heard and responded to, or something else?
So we sent over local motion along with AARP, as well as the Vermont Natural Resources Council, both of which are also on the stakeholder committee, sent over a document, I think last month, outlining those recommendations, as well as some others. We have not gotten a substantive response to that. We haven't had a meeting since that was submitted. It was basically just, thanks, we got it. We've talked about this a little bit in meetings, and we'll talk some more. So that's where things stand.
So are separated paths being preferred, or maybe I should ask DOT about that, just, separated, either shared use paths or just generally separated paths
So
are a good thing to do.
Well, so our perspective is that, local motion perspective is that paths are one good option of a variety of options depending on different contexts. And I would think that that's also, what AOT would say. And I think that's the approach in the document. We would view shared use paths specifically as one low traffic stress option for people walking and biking,
Right.
along with, say, a protected bike lane, which is different from a shared use path.
Right.
Or even a street, like if you think about like Warren's Village Center, where they've used a different street material like pavers and really traffic calmed it with different elements to create more of a very low speed shared street. We would also think about that as a low traffic stress environment. So that's what I'm getting at when we say ensuring a high quality facility for people walking and biking that still has a flexibility to it with a range of options.
Right.
So what we want to do is find a way to maybe provide targets to push the engineers and designers in that direction while still having flexibility.
It's too early to tell whether that's going to be in there.
Yeah.
I guess that's good. Is what I would say to the agency. We're hoping that that can be part of its guidance and standards, and that so we don't come back next year and hear testimony from the stakeholders say like, we presented this, it was ignored, and they have to go back and start over.
Yeah, and maybe it'd be helpful just to the contribution to the conversation here. Those are my notes. Don't look at those. But so this is a slide just showing basically a high level overview of what I'm talking about when I say level of traffic stress. And level of traffic stress is a measure that's used pretty widely in the transportation planning industry to objectively figure out how comfortable and by extension generally how safe a facility is going to be for a person biking. And there are similar measures for people walking. So on the right side where you see LTS 1 and 2, those are generally comfortable for the majority of the public to ride on. We have very few facilities like that compared to our overall road mileage in Vermont. This graphic shows, specifically like the example here is, protected bike lanes alongside, a fairly low speed street would be LTS 1, which is the most comfortable kind of facility. Or a slightly less comfortable facility would be like a painted buffer between bike lanes and cars on a slightly faster street. But those are just two examples of infrastructure types that could achieve those designations of LTS 1 and 2. What this document is showing is, how it's actually measured using a matrix approach. So this table specifically is looking at an environment where the bike facility is mixed with the cars. So there's no designated bike lane. It's just a shared lane. As you can see here, there's no way that achieves a 1 of LTS in this table. But then when you start looking at separated bike lanes, this would not be a protected bike lane, separate table, then you're thinking about, okay, is there a parking lane along that bike lane? What's the speed limit? How many through lanes? So this is the kind of approach we can use to have an objective measure to push our engineers and designers towards higher quality facilities. And we would like to see something like this integrated into the document.
That's great. Thank you.
It's all hard stuff because in a place where you have old downtowns that were built upon each other with narrow streets, it becomes harder to incorporate that all in without some conflict.
It can and it can't be. You know, for the Warren example is one where you can imagine a street that is traffic calmed, even in downtown. You know, you think about Church Street or College Street in Burlington. These are streets that are relatively low speed, and so they're also relatively comfortable to bike on. On the other hand, when you have something
But you aren't going to have green space between a bike lane and then in a downtown.
You could.
that may not be an option in certain contexts, for sure, right? You might be able to have street trees,
Yeah,
but maybe not
Right.
lawn. Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe not a green belt.
yeah.
Yeah. But there are still ways to account for that and to create comfortable walk and bike
And I-
facilities.
And at least, yeah, show it as a possibility.
Yeah.
It's really important. I mean, Stowe has that.
Yeah,
There are
it-
some- yeah.
It just thinking.
Yeah.
Did you have,
Well, I was just gonna ask the agency to respond to something like this, but being something in the guidance seems like something that you could see, and you're not saying like you have to be a 1. That would be kind of too stringent, but saying, here's this matrix, how you can decide how to get closer to it.
Or provide a target for specific areas. Say our target for downtowns and village centers is to achieve a level of traffic stress 1 for people walking and biking.
If I could respond to Aaron Sisson again with the agency, and I think I would agree with that, and that's that outcomes-based lens where we want a good outcome for the biker in the area. And so can we achieve that level of traffic stress 1 as an example of an outcome? We're thinking along the line.
So have it as a goal. It's okay.
Yeah.
Can I also just mention, I think, that it's helpful that in the guidance that we're pointing to these goals, but then providing tools like this,
Yeah.
maybe in the complete streets, manual.
Yeah.
So that, you know, people are understanding where to find the technical information that gives the specifications that we are hoping to achieve in the toolbox, and like Aaron had described.
Then you don't want to say like, well, we did a bike lane, but then you get out there, but according to this
Yeah.
matrix, it's the worst track.
I don't feel that I need to speak further more what's in the bill. I think this is really, the direction that we would like to see things go, but I'm happy to, if there are specific provisions that you'd like our perspective on, I'm happy to.
I would say we absolutely would like to have you back and we'd like to talk about this more.
Mhm.
We really appreciate the focus on the bill itself because we do have like a new tomorrow.
Yeah.
And,
Yep.
yeah, but, this has been very helpful.
Great. Happy to come back. Just let me know when. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Are you Jason?
Yes. There. Thank you for having me. I'm Jason Rasmussen. I'm the Executive Director for Mount Scottney Regional Commission. I'm here representing the Regional Planning Commission, SPAPTA, is our association. I happen to be chair of the Transportation Committee of SPAPTA. And so I'm here to really talk about the T-bill and quickly. and try to relate it back to, VAPTA had sort of a few priorities for this legislative session. And I think actually they're fairly well addressed in this draft. So we'll talk about that briefly and answer any questions that you have. That sounds
That'd
good.
be great. Thank you.
So I happen to be in case I'm missing something, I'm looking at the draft dated, the 14th, so I hope that's the current version. It's changed.
We moved a little beyond that.
Okay, all right,
Okay,
well,
let's
I
do
hope
it by section though.
Are you looking at draft 1.2?
this is 1.2, yes.
Yeah, we're on. So we have the 3.2.
I missed that, but.
Well, that's all right. We can just do it by the section.
So, there were 3 new sections added. The other one I was looking at, section 12 on cancellation of, locally managed projects. You like that one? That's good. There was also a section 13 on municipal transportation assets. And then there was also another third one, section 14 on, state town highway aid, municipal grant programs, et cetera. Those are all good. BAFTA likes those. Thank you for those inclusions.
There are sections 15, 16, and 17 in the most recent draft,
Okay,
and they're unchanged.
okay, thank
We
you.
would say, we totally appreciate the language of the House and increases in, but we'd like to get to a place where we understand what the need is to match what we do in the future, and knowing that pulling together that information is going to take time. Yeah.
Yeah, and so again, VAPTA had a few priorities this session. One of them was let's see, what's the current number now? My section 14, which is now
These sections 17.
17. Okay,
So,
Town highway,
grant?
small grant program.
yes,
So,
so sorry, 17. Yeah, so you're section 17. Sorry for my confusion. You know, we've early on in this legislative session, we met with the agency, and we talked about our priorities and we talked about theirs. One of the things we talked about, I say we, it was really Devin. It was anyway. Got to talk to the agency about these things, and you know, one of the things we were both talking about was the need to, you know, there's a level of frustration with getting local transportation projects done. And, you know, I think we all have ideas on what those factors that influence that are. But we thought it would make some sense to take a step back, do a study, and really figure out, you know, what are the primary issues and what can we do about them. And so I think that's generally reflected in this. But I think that's really helpful. I think, you know, we think of permit reform, the federal legal process. I mean, there's all these other factors, but I think this study will help us to just work together to come up with those solutions. Or I guess these are the issues, and then what do we do about addressing those issues? So we see this as a positive.
go ahead, Clayton.
I'm just wondering if this would address the concerns that I have about the process, about, sometimes local agencies need more time to understand or, apply for something or to implement something.
I think that would be one of the things that we would be looking at in looking at all these grant programs.
Okay.
And also in looking at the planning resources the communities have to be ready to apply for a grant successfully. And when I say successfully, that doesn't necessarily mean in order to be awarded the grant, although if they're successfully prepared, they're more likely to get the grant. But are they really ready to implement the project? Have they gotten far along? And do they have the technical resources through consultants or contractors or whatever to actually make sure the project moves? Oftentimes we'll have projects where right away hasn't been secured. They get the grant and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, we can't get so-and-so neighbor to participate with us. So yeah, I think those are things we would examine here.
Good, so it'll be process things too,
Yeah.
not just.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all want to get to a place where we fund the right projects and we get them through the process as quickly and as efficiently and as on budget as we possibly can. So anyway, we hope this is a step in the right direction.
Great.
Are there any other questions on that one? So one of the other issues that are our priorities were bike and pedestrian projects funding levels. And I gotta say, I'm not totally sure what all the details in the recommended budget are, but it's looking promising in that respect. I think we've seen over the years, you know, funding had been level for the bike and ped program, for example. at like $4.5 million a year. And the awards always outstrip what's available. And it's gone from 6 to 16 to $20 million over recent years. And so there's a lot of demand, inflationary price increases, all these sorts of factors that we all know about. So if there's any ability in this challenging time to increase to keep the funding level that increased last year, to keep it at that level or more, even if that's possible, is greatly appreciated. There's a lot of need out there. And we think bike and ped projects are really important as it relates to, making Act 181 happen, state planning goals, comprehensive energy plan for the state, all of these things. We think it ties in really well with that and ultimately helps us to have successful downtowns and sort of encourages investment in the downtown properties. So we think there's a lot of spin-off benefits to those things as well. Any questions on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Jason, so much for coming. It's lovely to see you. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the land use process. One of the major changes we made last session was really to put a lot of work on the RPCs over the next 6 years. I'm wondering if you could speak to any technical support that you might need related to transportation from the agency as we continue to develop out those plans.
It's a good question. Right now we're really deep in a conversation with the design standard update process, as you're talking about before. It's currently taking the form of having some context areas, and so that's really relating back very closely to the Act 181 future land use categories. So we think that's really, really helpful, and we're encouraged by what we're seeing so far. The hope is that we're going to have some really good design guidelines for our downtowns and for our rural areas and everywhere in between. So I think that'll be a great starting point. And I think, the agency is a great partner. I'm not sure exactly what levels of detail we're going to need, but I think we're all working on our regional plans now. And speaking personally, I'd love to just flag some of our draft policy language and these other things with agency folks, and we'd love their input. Everybody has time constraints, but we would love to work with the agency on some of that and just make sure we're all seeing as eye to eye as we can be.
Yeah, we've got our 6th committee member over there. Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate it. And thank you for your work in our area.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to do that. The final one I wanted to talk about was the cancellation of locally managed projects. So again, we're happy to see this inclusion of a study. We thought the earlier proposed changes to the federal payback, to the cancellation of locally managed projects, and whether they have to pay back the money or not. Some of the previous changes relating to some federal rules that were going to be eliminated at that point. That raised a few concerns for us. So I really like the idea of getting all partners, the main partners together, take that step back and study the situation, just to make sure that we're all hopefully on the same page. We understand the implications of those changes. I think some changes are needed in that section. I'd like to see some of those things. One of our concerns initially with right now it says it relates back to some federal rules. The Federal Highway Administration has some rules about if a project is canceled when it's in the preliminary engineering phase, it does not need to pay back those funds. So part of the conversation is, do we strike that? And we had initially some concerns with that because we thought it was getting rid of some guardrails. So that helped us to understand it as PE phase only. Okay, so not when you're in subsequent phases after that. And so again, one of our fundamental concerns is just sort of a lack of clarity, lack of criteria. When's the project required to pay it back? When is it not? So I think this is a great chance to sort of illuminate those situations. And I'm going to leave it at that unless there's further questions on that.
Yeah, I'm just not familiar with that issue at all. So did towns have to pay back or did the state have to pay back? I don't understand.
So, you know, we don't.
Jeremy is gonna be in
Okay,
the chair
okay,
after,
So he
and
can
he
define
can make
it.
a comment on that.
okay,
So, you know, we don't want projects to get canceled.
Sure.
We don't want them to, you know, pay it back necessarily because those are monies that can be spent elsewhere. But sometimes stuff happens. So, you know, primarily we're talking about like in pet projects or similar things that the town is managing. Sometimes stuff comes up. So there's the permitting process was unforeseen issues come up with that. It takes a lot longer to get the project done. The permitting requirements are so significant that it raises the cost of the project. Timelines sometimes get really significantly delayed because of certain factors. Costs then rise, inflation happens. All of a sudden, the town has their match amounts doubled or tripled. Now what, you know? And so I think those are the factors that we're thinking about. Way back decades ago when I started, it was fairly clear, you know, if you run into if projects like that run into hurdles, permitting issues, generally they would get forgiven. They wouldn't have to pay back the project if they canceled it because of permitting, insurmountable permitting issues. I think it's less clear today. And again, we just want, my thought is that this study is really helpful as it helps us to kind of put together, figure out when would that apply, when would it not apply? And I think that's beneficial for everybody.
okay, great, thank you.
Well, God, unless there's other questions.
Thank you very much for coming. This has been helpful.
Great. Thank you.
I think at this point, we're going to move to the federal funding update piece. I think that's it. And why don't you and Jeremy sit up there together? Because there's been some drafting around this. And it looks, well, unless you want to carry your chair up there.
Here, do you want to just?
I
have
was
Dee
gonna move the
introduce it?
6-member out someplace else. But
You want to start and introduce it? Sure. Good morning. For the record, I'm Damian Leonard from the Office of Legislative Counsel. Jeremy Reed, Chief Engineer, Agency of Education. Okay, so the language is found on section 4. And it probably should be retitled at this point. So it's section 4 on page 5 of draft 3.2. Currently titled Federal Funding Updates. As you'll see, it's more holistic in the current draft. So Jeremy and I worked together with the chair to try to refine the language, make it something that both provides accountability and oversight in a year where funding is particularly dynamic, while also not creating super high administrative burden that might result in just a deluge of information that's not entirely helpful. So that said, that's up to you to decide if it works. So this would require on or before September 30th and December 15th that the Secretary of Transportation provide the Joint Transportation Oversight Committee with a briefing on the status of state transportation fund revenues and federal funding for the fiscal year 26 transportation program and any impacts on the fiscal year 26 transportation program. So this would include a summary of federal funding received to date, federal funding anticipated later, and that should say in the state fiscal year, federal funding that is delayed, and federal funding that has been reduced or is subject to rescission. A summary of transportation fund revenues to date in the state fiscal year 26, a summary of the impacts on the fiscal year 26 transportation program caused by the changes in state fund revenues from the consensus forecast or delays or reductions in federal funding. and a summary of any legislative action that may be necessary to address the reductions in state revenues or federal funding. So that's the first part. It's two briefings. One that comes at essentially the end of the federal fiscal year, but the middle of our state construction season. And the second that comes at the end of the state's construction season. The next piece here, and it's basically those two are providing a holistic overview. Where are state revenues at? Where's the federal funding at? Do we have issues with grants that we were expecting being delayed, causing a problem? Are we seeing a major downturn in state transportation revenues, that sort of thing? Subsection B provides sort of discretion for the Secretary of Transportation to request another meeting with the Joint Transportation Oversight Committee if there is if the Secretary becomes aware of a significant change in state revenues or reduction in federal funding, rescission of grants, or delay in anticipated federal funding, that's going to impact the agency's ability to carry out significant portions of the 26 transportation program. And that's a request to meet within 14 days. So this is sort of, we just got some information. It's August 1st. We're not scheduled to meet for 60 days. Can we please meet in the next 14 days? Because this may require immediate action. And then the final piece here covers what happens if we have a really significant decrease. So if there's a decrease in overall state or federal funding that is in excess of 4%, the Secretary would have to prepare a written report detailing the impact of the decrease on projects that are in the 26 transportation program. So this report would get into the detail project by project. It's essentially an overview of what the reduction plan would be if we were going in front of the joint fiscal, but it's more focused on the work that this committee does, where it's saying we're going to have to cut or delay these projects in order to stay within our means for the year.
Okay.
That's exactly, yeah, way to go, team.
And the 4% is
Wasn't just
number
me.
the joint fiscal committee uses.
That's their threshold.
Yeah, that's their threshold.
That is really well done. Look at this.
Good. Jeremy?
Yeah, so we worked up together, definitely have a few concerns related to a project by project and just not inviting legislative influence to pick which project to get delays. I know that come to some shock, but it does sort of contradict any transportation management protocols we have. But I think this is a report and not necessarily eliciting approval. So we can make that work, and it significantly reduces the administrative burden that was presented in the previous version. So I think we're okay.
So, we're going to go through this again with you, Damien, to make sure we close out sections, but it sounds like we're pretty close here. Yes, awesome.
I really appreciate you taking the time to help us with this, because the point is not to have, I think, legislative decision-making influencing projects. It's to give us the opportunity to know what's going on. And also, if we are in a position to make a decision, and that is the appropriate response, we have proactive information to do so, because I think we're heading into a situation where we will not have the same standard of funding that we have anticipated from the federal government, and we will need to be having more connected conversations. So I appreciate you taking the time. Thank you, Daisy.
I would echo that and also add to that. In some, I think the economy now, not right now, is uneasy, and if it's a combination of both federal and our own revenues are in trouble. We saw March was not a good month. It gives some opportunity, so we have some awareness and are in front of the decisions. It's always bad when we have members that say my project was canceled, and you get that call and you have had no awareness of what's going on. Was there anything else we needed you for?
I don't think we've talked about the 10G updates.
Right.
So as actual language up to this point, yeah, which would be section 5.
Yeah, sections 5 and 6.
Okay,
So section 5 is the project dashboard proposal that was brought to you a few days back, in which I inadvertently left out of the last draft. So this would add a new subsection Q to section 10G. And it provides that the agency's annual proposed transportation program shall include the following information in a graphical dashboard: percentage of projects in each section of the transportation program that have been delayed by more than 1 year from the preliminary plan projected completion date, and the percentage of projects in each section of the program whose cost has increased by more than 50% or $5 million, whichever is less, from the preliminary plan cost estimate. So basically, you can look at where you're at with that preliminary plan stage, and then if we're going significantly over budget or significantly past the timeline that was projected, this will give you a depiction with sort of that dashboard setup, so you're able to sort of graphically see where we at, how are we comparing to previous years. And then subdivision 2 of that subsection provides that the agency would provide this committee and your House counterparts with quarterly updates to the dashboard. And so it's anticipated that this could be provided as an updated link to committee members that would go to the information on the committee or the agency's website. And then section 6 is repealing the existing subsection G within 10G. So 10GG, if you don't mind the alphanumeric salad. And this is the updates that are included at the back of your transportation program every year. And so I included all of the language just for context, so that you're able to see what's coming out and what's going in as you sort of evaluate the language. And then importantly, the effective dates. Section 5, so the new dashboard takes effect on January 1 of next year. And then the repeal of the 10G reports is actually July 1 of next year. So you would get both in next year's transportation program. And then after that, it would just be the dashboard, but that'll allow you to also compare and contrast with some time to make tweaks if you find.
so let me ask this question. I automatically see that NG report that's out there now starts at 10 million, this drops it to 5. What information in what is proposed will be there versus what is in the 10G report? Is there information that will be dropped, or what functionally is the difference?
So the current 10G reports actually list project by project the data, right? That was the baseline data versus the current, whether it be estimate or schedule. This is more programmatically assessing the overall program. When we spoke last time, there's some discussion that we didn't want to focus just on the 4 projects that may have gone over if 96% of the projects on time. So this captures where we are in the entire program delivery. And then obviously, if there are questions about what represents the 5% or the 10% of the delayed, be happy to provide that information. But this provides program level overview instead of a project by project listing.
Or we could get the project listing.
Yeah, if there's a specific question, happy to deliver that, but we would not publish that annually in the white book. It would just be on a sort of ad hoc approach. Hey, what about this project in my district? I heard that was delayed. And that could happen at a quarterly frequency as opposed to the annual frequency today.
Go ahead.
And there is both a 5 million, 10 million trigger in existing.
Yep.
contract for it. So this seems like you're getting rid of the 10 million, 100% and just saying 5 million, 50%.
Yeah.
75.
And we're moving the threshold because I think, well, we made some changes last year, but historically it was whenever it became front of the book project, which was that inception basically. And we just didn't have enough information. It wasn't really a vetted project at this point. So this moves it to, okay, we have some project definition at this point, and the estimate and the schedule is based on more than just a identification of a need, but actually some level of situational awareness. And so by changing the threshold, we also reduced sort of the variance that would trigger the reporting.
Good.
Everybody seemed fine.
We'll see.
Okay,
I'd like.
but we're gonna get both of them for 1 year.
Yeah.
I think that's great.
And I will caution, I've got to work with the IT folks this first year. I'm not sure how many data fields of historic projects we have captured that preliminary plan sort of milestone. So the first year, the data may be a little bit wonky, but as we move forward, I think that's the intent, is that this will start establishing
You
that.
might, if it's too wonky, have somebody in here say, give us 2 years of.
And we can certainly present it and address any concern about that.
Okay,
Is it fair to say that 2 project dashboard sections can be closed out at this point, or should I have them highlighted?
Future.
Yeah, you'll actually be able to see them in progress next year at the same time. So you'll have the dashboard and the 10G reports. And then you'll have time before the 10G reports are repealed to fine tune or tweak and come back and say this worked. This maybe could have been better.
But getting rid of the language doesn't change that.
Yeah, so the language, actually, I put in a 1-year delay on eliminating the language to ensure that there's
so we have an
overlap.
overlap here.
Yeah,
And if you don't move along fast enough for this, you may have a 2-year.
Correct.
Go ahead.
When you said the 2 dashboard sections, are you considering section 4 a dashboard section?
no, it's section 5 and 6. So 5 is adding in the dashboard, 6 is repealing the 10G reports.
Oh,
So they're
I
they're
consider
tied
that part
together.
together. So
Yeah.
those 2. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
okay with me.
So I'm gonna actually leave the state and federal funding highlighted simply because I made some word tweaks. So for my purposes, the editors are gonna have to look at it again anyway. But that'll be in gray tomorrow. The word tweaks were to specify state fiscal year, because the federal fiscal year ends on September 30th. And then also to just say state and federal funding for the title of the section.
So I'm gonna say that other than changing the title on section 4, 5, and 6, we're good to go.
Okay.
What does it mean, the gray title? I sent another section.
The gray highlights mean that to my knowledge, the committee hasn't closed it out yet, but the language hasn't changed since the last draft you saw. So, I'm leaving those highlighted so it's easy to find that. Otherwise, though, for purposes of the editors, they're just looking where there's yellow highlighting, and for your purposes, the only new language is in yellow. But gray language is language where I haven't gotten a clear thumbs up or down from the committee yet. So.
Since we're here and we've got 5 more minutes before we're scheduled with the Medicaid piece, and talk to us about section 3.
I can. So section 3. This is we haven't done one of these sections in a while, but we used to actually have these in a lot of T-bills. Although we would often give discretionary authority within the limits of the programs for the secretary to adjust appropriations beyond what's allowed under statute in some of the previous T-bills where funding was in flux. And so what this is saying is that notwithstanding 32 VSA 706, which is restrictions on how you can move around appropriations and the requirements around reversions and the limits of program, project, or activity spending, with the approval of the Secretary of Administration and subject to subsection B, the Secretary shall honor before the close of fiscal year 2025, which is a few weeks after, as I understand it, the actual date on the calendar where fiscal year 2025 ends, identify at least $686,000 in reversions from the fiscal year 2025 Transportation Fund appropriations, other than appropriations for town highway state aid structures and class 2 roadway programs to support the fiscal year 2026 transportation program. The reason we identified town highway state aid structures and class 2 and not other town programs is these are the programs that are state funding heavy. Others are federal or local match heavy. And so, or both. And so these are just things where it's basically, and this was standard language back when we used to do the appropriations adjustment, saying don't take it out of the town funding, just take it out of state funding. And then the Secretary's authority is limited to appropriations, the reduction of which by itself will not have the effect of significantly delaying the planned fiscal year 2025 work schedule of a project that formed the basis for the funding in fiscal year 2025. And then the Secretary shall honor before the close of fiscal year 2025, submit a written report to JFO and to the Joint Transportation Oversight Committee regarding the reversions identified pursuant to subsection A. One note there is that we may be able to take out the reference to JFO because the reversions may already be getting reported to the Joint Fiscal Committee, which JFO staffs, so they might be getting this information anyway. And I just need to confirm that. I didn't have time to last night. So, and the agency, I don't think you saw this before this morning. So I just want to be fair to them that they have not had a chance to review this language yet. So
This would bring us in balance.
my understanding of the intent is that this is to balance out the reductions in revenues to the transportation fund that were in S46 and the motor vehicle bill.
As it relates to the Senate position,
As it relates to the Senate position, if there are changes to that, then
if the House decides not to move ahead with the forestry piece that we passed, and they decide to do the SSI change or not do the SSI change, this becomes what the conference committee will have to figure out what the numbers, but at least from the Senate position, this would bring us in balance.
that's my understanding of the intent. But yeah, beyond that, I'll defer to the folks who are the money folks in the room. So, because I can't speak to quite how the balancing out project work or process works at the end of the year as well as the folks who
But
actually
at
look
least
at that.
from our fiscal position, because we started this by approving the reduction for SSI. And we also approved the forestry piece. So we were out of balance by 680,000, and this would take care of that. Go ahead.
I know we have, Mr. Blueberry behind us as well, so if there's any, I would look
I
at
think-
as well.
I think Logan worked on this, but go ahead.
Yeah, so for the record, Logan Rivera from Joint Fiscal Office. I don't know that I really have anything else to add besides the thing ahead. I do think this will achieve the intent of the committee, but also the agency wants to weigh in if it has any concerns. Be happy to discuss with them as well.
Okay. Go ahead.
The reporting part, are we looking, so you want to know specifically how they got to the 626?
Yep.
She says these are the specific reversions, not just showing 626. But so I was reading it when we were talking about the agency had looked at. So I assume you're not going to say anything today. Yeah,
That's correct.
That's a good.
Yeah, I was trying to be clear that they've had zero time to
Right, I just didn't
prepare
see their
evaluation
reaction like
language.
that. Like,
So
if they were like going to say something today, or they're going to wait.
Fine for me, stone face, so
Yeah.
thank you for confirming that.
Okay.
So just a question, so are these reversions similar to reversions in the capital villages? Like, is it funding that is not expected to be used? And so somewhere there's definition for reversions, I would expect.
Well, it could be that it wasn't expected to be, so it could be easy because we're going to do this anyway, so we can just revert it. But it could also be a project that they cancel.
Okay, so you can create reversions.
we get reversions from all over the place, depending on things. In some years you have, and I can't speak to the transportation program, but for example, with the capital bill,
Yeah,
each year you look at what you budgeted and you budget these big round numbers. And some projects run over budget and you need to move money into them, but others, you'll come out $2,500 under budget here, 30,000 under budget there. And so, last year's capital bill, for example, we had a couple pages of reversions that ended up in the ultimate amount that we then moved back into the capital fund to pay for the current year's capital bill. Basically, it's an accounting
right.
function.
So does V-Trans do reversions?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we have on that sheet, they have to do $4.5 million worth of reversions to get to balance at the end of the year. That's part of the reason that as we look at all of the finances and figure out where there are in projects, that in the next sections where we want a reporting back, there's some worry about what's that all gonna look like, so.
Okay. So this is a normal process that you do?
Correct.
Okay.
It's just unusual that we would direct a certain dollar for a bill like this.
Okay.
We're only directing a certain dollar number because we reduced
Okay.
the revenue.
I see the logic.
Yep.
Thank you.
They would have to do it anyway in some respects because they have to balance. They would
Right.
do it. But we're taking responsibility.
We're taking responsibility for the decisions we've already made.
Sure.
I take responsibility by telling the secretary.
Well,
Or is it not used somewhere else?
and to be
Yeah.
completely fair, we don't know what the House is gonna
Right.
do. And
It might not be 626.
yeah, it might not.
The only question I would raise here, and this is from my non-fiscal mind, is because the projected budget identified roughly 4.5 million in reversions to come into balance. Does this number need to actually be roughly 5.1 million? So 600 plus the 4.5? Or is this number going to accomplish the committee's intent? I'm not an expert in how the balance sheets work and how to make this function. I just want to raise that question as my very simple math mind is saying 4.5, but we're also down to 600. Do we need to have a different number overall? Or is this going to accomplish the function? And so I just leave that as a question for when the agency comes back and Logan speaks to this as you review it further tomorrow.
Okay, good.
Is there current language for the other reversions that the AOT does on a normal basis that they can pick it from the programs that are listed here?
So I think it's in the Logan, what's the name of the sheet? Sorry.
Yeah, so every year, it'll be in the budget issue, but I believe in the BAA, you give authority to, who's it, the secretary to make reversions or use carry forwards. And it's pretty just a blanket ability for them to make these changes, and then they report these to joint fiscal at the closeout of what reversions they made and from what programs like that. So there's nothing justifying them not to take it from town highway programs, stuff like that. And within the normal reversion process, they have done that in the past. I also want to make one note. This reversion will be taking place in the current FY25 budget, which of the last operating statement I saw, there's an estimation of $1 million of reversions going to occur. That estimation is completely up to the agency, really. So there's nothing saying that they have to spend or revert $1 million. So to Damien's question, the 686 is just to ensure that the choices this committee made are reflected and made whole by reducing last year's budget by 686 to use this year. But what other reversions they do or don't use is kind of up to the agency to decide based on spending and project timelines. So we really just have to specify sort of the reduction that this committee made, and then other reductions as needed will be made by the agency in the normal sort of budgeting process, which could be above this number if need be.
You could have made it next year, money, because it's next year that's affected, but we're doing it in advance.
Right. And so this is money from this year's program to fund the 26 program, which is what we're working on now. And I think you just answered my question.
Which occurs, yeah, and every year you'll see within the operating statement, there is generally a carry forward amount that is used for programs in the next year's budget. So this is just making them add in an additional.
That's in the operating stage.
Yeah.
So the CFO, you're getting her different.
Candace.
Yes.
Are we good to go with that?
Yeah.
I think we can mark that as okay too.
Great.
Although
Yeah.
I'm perfect commentary from the agency.
So when I'll leave it.
That I didn't hear them scream.
So
They usually go. So I think at this point, that's the last.
Yeah, we can talk offline about the payback, right? I can address it right now, whatever the chair's plan is.
We
Payback for local projects, you got the fund.
Oh, right. I can find that out later. Yeah.
we need to move on. I think the hallway is full of people for medical transports. Okay, yep. And then people go out in the hall and tell them that.
Yeah.
Please.
Elaine is on. Right.
I'm gonna go now.
The other thing I went to.
I agree with what I was.
I did eat.
Okay.
Yeah, you know, I was like going over there because man, it's food. Yeah, no, I thought it was really good.
Need another chair.
If we have another chair, it'd be great if we can bring us
You can
both.
take this.
So.
But yeah.
No, I'm fine.
Yeah.
I'll find another spot in the room.
Space
I'll let
is such a premium.
I'll let you reorganize it.
All right.
Musical chairs.
Give you the. The new draft, volunteer, so $20 there.
So, yeah, and then, yeah, they're, I'm trying to get it back.
Do you want slides?
Or
We do not have slides.
that's the language from existing language, but they put it last year. She wants to expand it. And then there's
Now,
the BA, but
we're
he
specifically.
wants to change it for next year. So I'm
Application, that's not it.
That'd be great. So, yeah, it helps if you guys say it.
yeah, so medical transports and the new draft start on
This section,
top of page 32.
right, but we're specifically talking about,
Uh, background checks.
Yes.
Page 33. Section 28, and then new draft,
yep,
and then,
it's-
yeah,
so
Page 30.
grade 33 at the bottom.
yeah, and then section 30 is the work group that involves, DEPA as well. So,
So Grace, and if you could give us your name and we're ready to listen.
Of course. Thank you, Chair Weston, and thank you for having us. For the record, my name is Alex McCracken. I'm the Director of Communications and Legislative Affairs for the Department of Vermont Health Access.
And my name is Grace Johnson. I work as a policy analyst at the Agency of Human Services.
And we very much appreciate the opportunity to be here with you this morning to discuss this bill. This was language that we received yesterday, so our analysis is pretty fresh. But we're happy to dive into what we have for the committee today for consideration. Firstly, DEVA appreciates the caveat that this proposed language would only apply to the extent permitted under federal law. That is a caveat that would likely be needed with any language in order to keep the Medicaid program, which is a joint state and federal endeavor, functional. To explain this, I want to lay out the federal requirements on DEVA, an additional reason DEVA requires background checks, and why these requirements and concerns are in tension with the current proposed language in this bill. After speaking to this, I will then discuss an approach that would allow the Medicaid program to operate under federal law while still paving the way for a potentially greater pool of drivers. First, our federal requirements. Before greenlighting any service provider participation in the program, DEVA is required under federal law to employ either background checks or a quote level of screening based on risk of fraud, waste, or abuse. This level of screening, as required by federal law, can vary according to category of provider, but the department's duty to guard against fraud, waste, and abuse applies to the NEMT program. Given this, DEVA likely could not comply with the language as proposed by BPTA. DEVA must also ensure that any category of provider who participates in Medicaid funded activities are subject to federal database checks. This is to confirm the identity of the individual in question and to ensure that they have not committed an offense that would lead the federal government to bar them from participation in the Medicaid program. Both the level of screening background check requirement and the database check requirement are directly cited in DEVA's current NEMT provider manual. That manual requires checks through federal databases, for example, the HHS exclusion list and the National Crime Information Center. The manual also requires screening through more local databases, like the Vermont Crime Information Center, in order to identify any offenses occurring locally and not reported to the FBI that would still trigger fraud, waste, and abuse concerns. Second, another purpose for DEVA's currently required background checks: member safety. DEVA's currently listed checks are intended to safeguard the basic welfare of some of Vermont's most vulnerable. Medicaid members in Vermont include children, individuals grappling with complex mental health conditions, individuals with severe disabilities, the elderly, and other vulnerable populations. Some of these individuals may be receiving long-term care Medicaid, which is a form of Medicaid subject to even more stringent background checks for providers. Specifically, the Affordable Care Act rolled out CMS's national background check program in order to conduct background checks on a statewide basis on all prospective direct patient access long-term care providers. More research is needed to determine whether volunteer NEMT drivers would fall into that bucket, but at a minimum, exempting these drivers could create a disjointed system in which an elderly Medicaid recipient could be assured of a background check provider who meets the standards of the federal government at the doctor's office, but not on the drive to the doctor's office, even though the transportation is, from a member lens, not something many members can opt out of in order to access their needed care. In line with this reasoning, the NEMT manual also requires checks of Vermont's child abuse and adult abuse registry. Put another way, if we don't pay for a child to receive care from a nurse convicted of abusing children, we also don't want to pay for that child to receive a ride with someone who has abused a child. To do that would create precisely the situation we would like to protect that child from. Now I will turn to how these considerations impact our assessment of the current proposed language. First, the current language of this bill directly contradicts the NEMT manual. The bill's proposed language merely requires that volunteer drivers pass any background checks imposed by any part of the state. This would, in effect, leapfrog over the tightly enumerated checks that the department currently requires in order to address both federal law and member safety. For example, under the proposed language, someone who passed an initial background check to volunteer with a hunter education course at the Department of Fish and Wildlife would therefore be allowed to volunteer as a driver ferrying medically vulnerable Medicaid members. However, that Fish and Wildlife check may not include the adult abuse registry check or the child abuse registry check, and almost certainly does not include checking the federal exclusions list for Medicaid. Additionally, the NEMT manual requires checks of employees, subcontractors, and volunteers prior to initial hire so that they may be rechecked annually. This bill, as currently proposed, would create a disjoint between employees and contractors on the one hand and volunteers on the other. It would also force the department to a 3-year look-back period that would in effect render the yearly check process moot. The department is concerned that this latter change could severely impact member safety. The department also is concerned about the proposed variance process. The department does not currently review each volunteer driver applicant. If the department were called upon to do so and to bear the responsibility of deciding who gets to drive a child, an elderly person, or a medically vulnerable individual, as we do with standard provider enrollment, that would not look like a mere waiver approval process. Instead, we would have to check that person against precisely the databases and the fraud, waste, and abuse regulations already referenced. Our internal enrollment processes are not automatic, and without the current checks in our NEMT manual, we would not be able to conclude with any confidence that a proposed driver was safe for the purposes of transporting Medicaid members. Now I want to turn to proposing a solution. As I have just stated, DVA is constrained in our ability to waive background checks. Regarding the administration of the NEMT program, CMS has directly stated, and this is a direct quote, in terms of financing, Medicaid is not responsible for the general operation or deficit financing of public or private transportation providers. Thus, if the NEMT program is to remain funded and operational, the federal government has told the states that Medicaid requirements cannot be altered to meet the needs of the local transportation network. Instead, funding for NEMT must meet the requirements of the joint state and federal venture that is Medicaid. This proposed legislation, as currently written, would seem to waive existing rules and valid safety checks in order to address the operation of the transportation network. DVA does not believe we could justify that if we were audited by the current federal administration or indeed by any federal administration, and we would like to propose a path forward that would be more in line with federal law and guidance. DVA's current contract for NEMT is due to expire soon, and the department is required to engage in an RFP process this summer. Before we do that, we would like to hear directly from VPTA and other bidders and interested parties regarding what sorts of offenses they are seeing that prohibit potential volunteers from participating in the NEMT program. DVA would propose to work closely with VPTA and other interested parties and bidders to identify the areas of concern driving this ask. We would potentially work out categorical exemptions, tightly defined classes of individuals who are still subject to the requisite background checks, but who do not raise member safety concerns or fraud, waste, and abuse concerns. The department acknowledges the benefit of additional volunteer drivers in the NEMT program, but we do not feel that the current proposed language is the appropriate method or venue to do so. The department acknowledges the benefit. DVA would respectfully request the committee to remove this language from H488 and allow DVA and VPTA to engage directly with each other on this issue as we remove this into the expired contract. Thank you, senators.
Thank you for your statement. This is not an issue that's new. And we certainly don't want to do anything that is not federally required. And what I would say to you is, this is not the first time we've heard from the public transit agencies about this issue and the working forward around that. I think what we're looking for here, and we've heard this from the Agency of Transportation, so it's all across the board. I think and I'm going to speak for myself, we're happy to have you work it out with the players involved. But we want to make sure that that happens, because this is an issue that has been around for a very long time now. So what we don't want to do is remain silent in this. We are willing to consider changes in language, but we want to force the issue of you and Diva speaking with and explaining to the public transit agencies and the Agency of Transportation and the whole group. And this is particularly vital because we know the contracts are coming up a year from now. So in that context, how can we help facilitate the process whereby you can be clear with all of the players involved, the pressure that you're under, and if there is any way to make this better in the process, that we can get somewhere on it. Because in the legislature, I will speak for the former chair of my afternoon committee. She tried at least twice to include language to push this along, and it's come to no avail. So we do have an interest in here of helping to facilitate you all coming together to be clear with each other and explore if there is any opening. Go ahead.
I second that.
Thanks.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Senators. And I appreciate that as well. And I believe from our perspective, we're happy to continue that conversation with BPTA. We do want to find a solution that works long term.
And if you had some suggestions about language, our drafts person is here, and because we don't want to remain silent on this. Go ahead.
No, that was gonna be my ask with you about language in the bill, specifying that this will happen by a certain date, maybe, or something. And
Yeah.
something that you guys could probably hash out.
I can happily connect the relevant players at DEVA with Ledge Council, and we can put together some language proposal for you. I think there could be some benefit in some of the reporting requirement as listed here. And maybe if the language were in a different kind of form, it might be more acceptable to the department.
Yeah, and we were happy, but what we would like to do is facilitate and push this along so we're sure that something's going to happen, because I can assure you that if the majority of the people in this room are back here next January, probably somebody's going to be asking questions about where did this get to.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of that conversation will be coming through the RFP and the contract negotiation process this summer.
And we know that the contracts are up the middle of next summer. Go ahead.
The RFP, you're planning to issue the RFP in June.
Yes, Grace, that's correct.
Yeah.
So yeah, it seems like there's a hopeful solution with some language that we can make sure is in the RFP or in our pre-RFP process if we do any of that pre-bidders conferences or anything. But we just got to make sure it's time before you issue the RFP.
And we're under time constraint.
Of course, of course.
Tomorrow we have to have our bill out.
Okay.
So if we can get something quickly. I don't see, and you might as well stay there. I don't see Jim Moulton. Are you speaking for
Mr. Chairman, is Elaine Hitchcock?
Elaine? Would you?
Good morning. So I think this is really positive progress, and I want to thank the committee. I appreciate your attention on this important issue, and I also appreciate DEVA being here engaging in this discussion. And it has been a challenge for a long time, and we're really excited and appreciate the opportunity to see what you can draft so that we can sit together and see if there's any way to, any opportunities at all to streamline it, because that's all we want to do is increase our capacity with drivers. So we look forward to it and we are very grateful for this opportunity.
You can sit with our draft person and work out something that we can pass around to the public transit agencies and the agency itself. We're not wed to this language, but we're wed to the idea that there's a conversation and that there's a better understanding between all the players of what can and can't be accomplished, or what we might be able to push back and ask. We ask for Medicaid waivers all the time on stuff, but that is difficult. But we want to be realistic. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay.
And appreciate being in here with us, with you. We don't get to come to your meeting.
We're second to DEVA in our formula funds from the federal government.
But no less complicated.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair Westman. Thank you for this.
Right. So, I think Justin's in the hall.
Oh, it's a popular place today.
And then we have the deputy I think the two of you should move right to the end of the table.
Oh, you want to go there?
You get to sit on there. What?
The code is
The house.
Yeah. That's Justin. We have the section on our race car. Where's that?
Yes,
Well, now.
just drove over anyone. Let's see, that is.
It's a very end.
That was it last.
Section 31. Page 37, so that's. Ultra low volume vehicle manufacturing cars, home built motor vehicles.
I want you to know we like race cars. You know,
I am as well.
I just signed the in my everyday life. I work at VSEC, and one of the things we do is sponsor a race car at Thunder Road. And so I just signed a contract to sponsor a race car there for the Vermont 529 plan. So we like race cars.
Some of us like race cars.
Oh, but somebody was, the car that was in the yard got her picture right. So, could you, talk to us about the language?
Sure. So do you want me to?
Absolutely.
So, this was at the suggestion of the chair, I come up with this language. And to be clear, this is not about race.
No,
What
but-
we-
right, but it's,
well,
you know,
it's-
that was a sporty little car we looked at.
It was, and one of the challenges we had is that, you know, when you go to register a car, and we could get a VIN number from DMV, they'll tell you that, we could meet most of the things in the inspection manual, the list of things you go through, like lights and, you know, seat belts and all that sort of thing. But one of the challenges we have is around the emission standards and what has to be certified and not certified. So a big part of this is there a way that we could put something in together particularly for really low volume vehicles, like either kit cars or home built or really low volume manufacturers, so that they wouldn't have to spend what can be millions of dollars on certifying things. They do this in California. This is the other thing we're thinking about, California, which is pretty well known for being fairly strict on things like emissions. Vermont follows the California emission standards. But they do have a waiver process for low volume vehicles, and they have it's a capped number. And you're able to apply for it. If you get it, then that vehicle gets a specific number attached to it for the life of that vehicle. So it can't be moved to different vehicles, and wherever the vehicle is, that number goes with it. And what I didn't want to do was presuppose what any of that would actually look like in here, because obviously it's as much a natural resources issue in some ways as it is a transportation issue, but rather just set up a mechanism to bring together a few people who could look at this and see if there was something that we could come up with that would make sense for Vermont, and then bring it back here, not wanting to sort of negotiate it out in the middle of the session, which I don't think is necessarily the best way to do it. So that's really all this was. And it was sort of drafted, and there were 5 people, and so it's a fairly small group. I certainly recognize that state agencies have plenty of work to do as it is, but that was the plan, that we could look at this and look at what California does, look at some other states, see if there was something we could come up with that made sense for a small number of vehicles. And in the case of Rothspeed, the idea was that maybe we could get to a point one day we could actually register a car that was built here and have it here. Buying it will be another issue, but at least make that possible. So.
And we might not need to change the manual. That was the wording that struck me. So maybe it's a waiver process.
Absolutely.
Manual stays the same, but you're like,
yeah,
say whatever,
right.
5 cars a year, you can get a waiver if A&R agrees to it, and it doesn't jeopardize our
Correct.
standard with the EPA,
Right.
and all that.
Absolutely, yeah. And, in California, it's 500 cars. Obviously, it's a much bigger state with more population. So somewhere between 0 and 500, there's a magic number. I didn't want to presuppose what that was, but.
So I think it would be good to change that number too.
Yeah, so a couple of things to note. So because there is a general interest in the General Assembly this year to avoid study committees, I turned it in for a report from DMV in consultation with the stakeholders, so the manufacturers and so forth. I went with 325, which is the waiver number for California. So I looked up the Air Resources Board's waiver, and ours is set at, they allow manufacturers with 5,000 worldwide, but 325 in state.
Right, that's a federal number.
Yeah.
That comes out of the federal bill, yeah.
Right, so they went with I think it was the SAVE Act, I think at the federal level.
But they
yeah.
cap the total number of waivers that they will give in any 1 year to 500.
Oh, okay, I had seen 325 in the regulation.
I think
so.
The 325 defines
Oh,
low
defines
volume
manufacturer,
manufacturer, and the
500
500 was their weight. So basically the first 500 to get it, then if you're number 501, you have to wait till next year. But I don't know that's not a Vermont number, clearly. And I think we could come up with a number. I think
you don't have a number. You have that.
So we just defined the manufacturer size as someone who manufactures not more than 325 worldwide.
Well, that would be, that's actually a pretty big number too.
Yeah. What was the number? 6?
We're looking at 6. Yeah.
So this allows some room to grow. So what we could do on number 2, right now it says identify changes to the inspection manual necessary to create a cost-effective process for certifying the safety. And what we could say instead is identify any necessary rule or statutory changes.
Well, what about just putting it into one where you're waiving both emission and other inspection requirements?
Yeah, or we can just say identify a cost-effective process for certifying the safety.
Yeah.
And then and correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand the California process, they've got two pieces. The Air Resources Board does the admissions and creates the waiver program. And then they also have a process for basically ticking cars that are not a mass-produced car.
Right, for like engineering type inspection.
Right.
So Vermont has a similar thing for home built cars now, I believe, and street rods and where it works better for them in Vermont right now is if it's I think for street rods, it's pre-1949, then the emissions piece doesn't count anyway because it's too early. But we do have a mechanism where you have to go to a certified inspection station to get signed up. So some of that already exists. And I mean, I'm sure DMV would be in good position to be able to work out what of that might need to change or just stay as it is right now.
So,
But yeah,
go ahead.
Can we hear what DMV?
I was just gonna say that I agree. Giving us the time to review, I think is advantageous for everybody. I'm not opposed to it at all.
So I'll make,
I would say that the 325 number, I think it would be if anybody had any question, if somebody said, I'm gonna have a manufacturer with 325 cars in our small community, so I think a lower number that more realistically looked at what we're trying to do at this point would be a good thing to do.
100.
Even 100, at this point, they're looking at 6. So,
right. The other thing to note though is this is worldwide production.
yeah,
And so that kind of brings us into the question of whether you have someone open up a small shop in Vermont and then they've got a larger shop. Let's say since tariffs have been in the news, larger shop across the border in Quebec. I don't know the manufacturer that does that currently, but it's conceivable that you see something like that. But whatever number you guys want, I'll put in for the definition of the manufacturer. It'll exclude some of the bigger sort of resto-mod and reproduction vehicle makers, but would include the smaller guys like the folks who spoke to the community the other day.
we need to be quick about this though. So if you can talk to them and doctor this up.
I don't know that you necessarily need to put that definition here. I mean, it could be included as part of the report. For the
So for purposes of the report, it was basically just trying to identify what we meant by an ultra low volume motor vehicle.
And I threw in the word ultra because low volume vehicles are already defined under federal law.
Right.
As 320. So I guess I was thinking something smaller than that, but
yeah. I think for purposes of the research, like, is there a threshold on this report that we're looking at? Because it's just providing guidance for the ultimate sort of comeback.
how big's the
Yeah.
If 325 is a federal guideline, if you said,
yeah, that's how they have a low volume vehicle program that uses 325 domestically and 5,000 worldwide.
Yeah.
Okay. Since we're not going to come anywhere close to that here, I don't see why we shouldn't. I mean, there's two ways to look at it. One, I think we should stay in line with federal regulations. So it's got continuity. Two, we'll never reach that. So I don't think it matters.
Yeah, well, yeah, from my vantage point, I think the specific request has been to help the manufacturer expand. And so
it's also worth noting that this definition actually puts us at less than 10% of the worldwide production of the federal low volume program, where it's 5,000 and then 325, you can get that exception.
Yeah.
So I just took the lower number. If you want to know my process, I picked the lowest number I found and I put it in there. So it was kind of arbitrary, ultimately, but it was trying to capture this idea of,
Right.
we're not talking about, a major manufacturer. We're talking about small manufacturers that you might see moving into the state or operating in the state.
I have no problem with the 325. I suspect ultimately we will end up with if it is a waiver process, then there'll be a cap way lower than that.
Yeah. Okay. I work out some language that will be top on the list tomorrow because we want to get something in here.
Right. I will send you, the language isn't the most recent draft, but I can just email you the section. And then if you want to send me suggested edits, if you have any, that'll work.
That works.
Okay.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you.
I'll do that.
Thank you.
20 minutes before the last schedule. I don't take 10 minutes right now. If we're back here at 20 after, there's a couple of pieces in this that are hanging out